all the logistics getting me here. It's great to be back back in Williamsburg, in my alma mater. I graduated here in 1975, degree in biology, and had really a great set of professors, Dr. Ware, Dr. Bird, Dr. Brooks, Dr. Mangum, many others that, and they all had this sort of deep passion for science, and we're still sort of practicing in the field, and we did lots of field trips out into the Chesapeake Bay and the surrounding areas, and really in many ways the sort of roots of my career in conservation were started here at William and Mary. I'll also point out that there's another alum in the room, my brother Destry, over there as well, another William and Mary alum who has also devoted his entire life to conservation work as well. I want to share quick greetings with my co-author for the book, Dr. Gary Mackless. Gary is a Clemson professor, but he served as my science advisor when I was the director of the Park Service. And then coming out of the Obama administration, where both of us served for the 2 terms, we really wanted to make a statement about our experience in working for the president and working in conservation. Both of us had over 40 years of work in this field, and in that time you learn a lot, obviously, about science, about policy, about the politics of our parks and public lands, and we tried to capture that in a relatively small book, but small books can have big aims. I'm going to talk for maybe 20 minutes or so, and then we'll get up on here and open it up for questions. And so be thinking about those. I like to say that I worked in the bush of Alaska and did a lot of public meetings up there, and often the audience was both armed and drunk, and so I'm sure this audience will be a lot easier. As Alan pointed out, I worked for the Park Service for 40 years. The Park Service just turned 100, and so I worked for 40 of those 100 years. So I have a few opinions about conservation in general. Also, in those 40 years, I have a lot of great stories. Grizzly bear stories in Alaska at 50 below zero, and being involved in many of the sort of major events across the country, particularly fires and hurricanes and floods and oil spills. And I've also had an extraordinary opportunity to meet really amazing people. I had breakfast with Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the Enola Gay on the island of the Tinian, where the plane took off to bomb Japan. I walked the Selman and Montgomery Trail with John Lewis, the foot soldiers of the Voting Rights Act, and now Congressman. I took Pope Francis through Independence Hall, and I've taken Presidents Carter, Bush, Clinton, and Obama to various national parks as well. Kind of look back on them as a little bit of fondness. But I'll only tell you one story today. I could spend all day up here telling stories, but I will tell one. And that was one of the projects that we worked on in the Park Service when I was director was a partnership with the National Geographic Society called the BioBlitz. And anybody participating in BioBlitz? Yeah, okay, good. So these are basically 24-hour sort of intensive surveys of all the biological biota of a particular park unit. And it's a combination of citizen science and kids and volunteers and scientists and rangers, and you go in and intensively survey these parks. And I was in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, and there was a group of 4th graders as doing part of the BioBlitz in this meadow stream, and they were down in the creek, and they were getting muddy and wet, and they were catching whatever they could catch. And I walked over, and there was a little girl, probably 10 or 11 years old, and she had one of those little magnifying boxes, and she had something in there, and she was looking at it. And I walked up to her, and I said, "So, what you got?" She said, "Looks like a chironomid." And I said, okay, here's my card. You call me when, in about 10 years. Seeing that kind of engagement of a young person in the outdoors, learning, having fun, having an experience that they will probably carry with them, gives me some hope, frankly, for conservation, particularly in these troubled times. And that it gives me hope, it also means that we need to take some specific actions now if conservation is going to have a future. And that is sort of why Gary and I wrote this book. On one, we wanted to sound the alarm. No question that the Trump administration's assault on our parks and public lands and on conservation writ large was a concern. We wanted to use the book to talk about the lessons that we have learned and how they could be applied in the future. We wanted to provide some sort of practical strategies for action. It's really not enough to be outraged. It's not enough to just provide resistance. Those are important. But we also need to have effective strategies to advance the cause of conservation. And we have some that we think they're bipartisan, they're respectful of differences, they're inclusive, they're science-informed, and they're practical, and they're forward-looking. And so we want to talk about those. And I'm going to share some of those. I'm not going to read the book to you, but we'll cover a lot of it. And frankly, we also want to sort of declare some confidence in the future, that there is resilience here. There is some of these institutions, like the College of William and Mary and others, and the conservation movement, in terms of their sort of contribution to the nation, that these can survive and maybe even thrive. The book, this little book is illustrated with, at the beginning of each chapter, with some photographs, and we start with a particularly interesting photograph. It was the crowd gathering at Gettysburg just before Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. We begin with that picture, and we end with a picture of the American flag at a 4th of July parade. And we chose those specifically because we feel that conservation is deeply patriotic. It is not something that is only for one segment of society, that it's core to American history and Americans' core values. So our chart in this book and in my talk is going to be from alarm to action to optimism as we go through this. And I'll touch on each element today. So we can't really start this without sounding a bit of an alarm. And I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I'm going to hit some of the highlights in terms of sort of the current state of affairs as I see it and as Gary sees it from sort of the current assault on conservation. So abandoning, or at least threatening to abandon the Paris Accord on climate change really leaves the United States almost alone in the world in terms of their support around climate change. The administration has been eliminating citizen advisor groups that were created specifically to provide public input into the way we manage our parks and public lands. There are a few critical positions that have yet to be filled, including my old job, the Director of the Park Service, Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM. Others are just actings that have been placed in these jobs. And as a consequence, the agencies are just adrift, to be blunt about it. There's been a consistent removal of scientific data from a variety of websites that would have been available to the public for their own environmental action. And then there's a very specific sort of muzzling of federal scientists that talk about climate change, in particular if there's an assertion within their work that climate change is anthropogenic. They're muzzled. And then, over time, projects that have been assembled around the collective collaboration amongst communities and organizations like the Chesapeake Bay Initiative or the Great Lakes, all are being sort of undermined and dismembered while they talk about they want collaboration. There have been rescinding of policies, including One that I helped create, which was the Director's Order 100, which was all about how we were going to manage parks into a much more dynamic future driven by climate change. We put this thing together with the advice of an extraordinary science committee with a couple of Nobel laureates and others that worked on this thing for years. We developed the policy internally, and they have rescinded it at the end. Certainly the highly public reduction of national monuments like Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante, just purely for public gain or political gain, and really ignoring the coalition of tribal interests, particularly Bears Ears, that have lived on these lands for thousands of years and felt that they needed to be protected. There's been rolling back of environmental regulations, some very, very specific for public health. Things like the companies no longer need to report what the chemical content that they use for fracking wells is no longer made available. And then cutting back funding, or at least requesting to cut back funding. Congress has been a little bit different about that, but including climate change research as well. You know, they expanded Outer Continental Shelf oil leasing across the nation, while at the same time reducing safety oversight of these platforms. And this is near and dear to me. I served as an incident commander on the Gulf oil spill for 3 months, cleaning up. I had responsibilities for about 200 miles of shoreline on the Gulf, and can see the consequences of these kinds of hazards. And then in the name of infrastructure, you know, fixing the nation's failing roads, bridges, and infrastructure, they propose to gut almost every environmental law that we have on the books to expedite these kinds of things. And then when you oppose them, then the politics of personal destruction come into play. And if you followed a little bit in the press, the National Park System Advisory Board, which is a citizen board, they volunteer, they do this out of their own goodwill, they get no compensation, and they were completely dissed by the administration and frankly attacked when they left, rather than just a thank you for your service kind of thing. So all of these things are very, very troubling, and they could very well have long-term consequences, long-term conservation consequences to our land and our water and our public lands and the communities that depend upon these things. And they undermine decades of work by scientists and public servants and conservation organizations. And I think it would be a mistake. Gary and I both believe that to isolate this to just this administration, that it's probably deeper than that. That there is a sort of deeper populist movement. It's not just here in the United States. You can see it around other parts of the world with this sort of building resentment against science, against the media, against minorities, against immigrants, against the government, and against conservation has gotten thrown in to that same bucket. And so we would be naive to think that this is just going to sort of go away with a change in administration. And so we've got to think about sort of the deeper causes of things, like, you know, working class resentment around being disrespected or forgotten, or you know, not really securing their own sort of economic opportunities. So there's a bridge here that we have to keep in mind about cause and not just focus on the effect. So for conservation to navigate these rough waters, we need to have both an immediate and a long view, and to respond to these current threats and the underlying causes to what Gary and I describe as strategic intention. And so strategic intention means that when you take an action for conservation, it is not useful in just its own right, just that one specific thing, but to think of it in terms of its cascading effects, positive cascading effects. And a very simple example would be when you take a young group, a youth corps or whatever, and they're involved in a very classic kind of restoration project. They're investing their own energy into something that will have long-term positive benefits. And they'll come back year after year after year to see that, or maybe bring their friends to show them how this place and how this lands have healed as a result of their own work. Now we pulled this off with the Park Service's centennial. And this book is not about the Park Service. We use the book, the Park Service only as an example. But the Park Service centennial was an opportunity to sort of re-engage the American people in the care about these places. And we ran a campaign specifically targeted to the millennials that was with the hope of building new advocates and new supporters for not just national parks, but all of our parks and public lands as well, and conservation writ large. We were a little bit overly successful. I would say that in 2016, we had hosted 320 million visitors to the national parks. That's more than all of Disney, national football, national baseball, national basketball, NASCAR, and soccer combined. And so the parks are a little bit overwhelmed. But you know, to be blunt about it, I'll take that over apathy or indifference any day. That while they are crowded, but there was this intent behind it to build a new way of connection to these places, and we know that it has worked in the past as well. So in our book, we outline about 14 specific strategies, and I'm not going to go over all of them, but I'm going to talk about some of them. And the way we look at them is that some organizations have done some of them some of the time, and in some places. But there has not been a collaborative, a coherent approach to this. And that's sort of what we call for, is a much more systemic and broadly applied set of strategy across the nation. So a couple of these that we talk about are the creation of data havens, places that scientific data can reside and not be sort of disappear when you get this sort of hostile administrations. We need to improve the training of scientists to be, frankly, better communicators and to be more articulate. And also we need to be preparing them to be good litigators because they are going to have to be brought forward as professionals to speak in the many, many court cases that are going to be playing out over the next decade. Engaging youth, obviously, is a great investment, and particularly when you think about it in a ladder of experiences from every kid in a park at the 4th grade to youth corps in high school to SCA and the like in college to a career, not necessarily in conservation, but to a career that still carries the values of conservation before. We need to really work at the local level to be much more effective, particularly in rural America, I think. This is critical, and it's a great example up in Maine. You know, we were able to establish the first new national park unit in the North Maine Woods, the Katahdin Woods and Waters, which was a donation from Roxanne Quinby, the founder of Burt's Bees. She donated about 85,000 acres of her own private land and a $20 million endowment. But there was a lot of local opposition. And a lot of that opposition was turned by her son, Lucas St. Clair, by what he called drinking 1,000 cups of coffee. And he basically said, I'll sit down and meet with anyone. And he basically sought out the primary people opposed. Go to their house, knock on their door, and go inside and sit down and talk about what can we do together? How can we find that sort of common ground? And, you know, my own experience working in bush of Alaska or rural Idaho or rural Oregon is that there is still out there, I would say, a deep and untapped source of conservation advocacy, often ignored, frankly, by many of the traditional conservation organizations. And so I think engaging rural communities directly and listening and understanding what their needs are is going to be key to this as well. I think also we need to engage, and very, very respectfully, our communities of color that are often in parts of urban America that have no parks, have no green space. And it's really great to see an organization like the Trust for Public Land shift their priorities and begin to really, really invest in creating parks and creating green spaces within communities that were park deficient, for lack of a better term. We also must expand the recognition and the sharing of the American story. That that all too often there are components of our society that are completely left out. So I'll read you just a little section in our book here. Every aspect of American history has more than one story, more than one perspective. The Americas were not discovered by Columbus, as there were millions of pre-1492 inhabitants with elaborate language, art, architecture, music, religion, and trade. Westward expansion ultimately connected the West, mid-continent, and East Coast into a continent-scale country, but decimated the existing nations of Native Americans. The Emancipation Proclamation granted freedom to 4 million African Americans, but they still had to fight for another 100 years to achieve legally protected civil rights. Hispanic heroes fought in the Civil War. Suffragettes chained themselves to the White House fence, and Japanese Americans fought bravely in World War II, even as their families were incarcerated in camps back home. So we attempted in the Obama administration to sort of begin to fill in those gaps. So with strong and often bipartisan community support, President Obama established new national monuments that represented these untold stories. Cesar Chavez, Harriet Tubman, Pullman, Belmont Paul Women's Equality, Fort Monroe, First State, Honouliuli, Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers, Stonewall, Reconstruction Era, Freedom Riders, and Birmingham Civil Rights. These sites contribute to a more complete story of America, and by placing them alongside the Lincoln Memorial, Gettysburg, and the Grand Canyon, they help engage citizens who may feel distanced from the traditional and narrower American narrative.